The Vikings in Greenland weren't wiped out. They wiped themselves out. For 500 years, they survived in these frozen lands. Then, they vanished without leaving a single trace behind. Most people think this collapse was caused by one tragic event, but they're wrong. So how did it all really begin? Once the brutal climate tightened its grip, the Vikings faced a problem no one could ignore. Farming in Greenland had become nearly impossible. The short summers and harsh winters didn't just damage crops. They destroyed the very way of life they had built for centuries. Imagine planting barley, oats, or hay, only to watch the frost kill it overnight, year after year. But here's the crucial part. The Vikings themselves made it worse. Instead of adapting their farming methods to the harsher climate, they clung to traditions that had worked in Norway centuries earlier. They tried to raise livestock the same way they had in milder lands, feeding cattle and sheep on fragile pastures that could barely survive the frost. Livestock died, crops failed, and their food reserves dwindled. Some historians argue it was pride, others say cultural rigidity. But whatever the reason, these choices turned small problems into life-threatening crises. One of the main ways Greenland's Vikings sustained their lives was through trade. In particular, the tusks of marine mammals walrus ivory were highly valuable in Europe and served as a major source of income for the Vikings. These tusks were used by Europe's nobility to craft sculptures, weapon handles, and decorative items. However, starting in the 13th century, several problems arose in quick succession. First, demand began to shift. The European market for walrus ivory started to decline, and new trade goods emerged. At the same time, the walrus population in Greenland began to dwindle. The cooling climate, combined with increased hunting pressure, made these animals much harder to find. The collapse of the walrus ivory trade was more than just a loss of income for the Vikings. It directly affected their economic independence and survival strategies. In a period when farming was already extremely challenging, Greenland's Vikings no longer had a strong trade connection with Europe. The breakdown of the economic system made it increasingly difficult for families and communities to meet their basic needs, pushing their society closer to collapse. The Greenland Vikings were a community heavily reliant on constant trade and communication with Europe. Food, timber, iron tools, and luxury goods arriving from Europe made life in this cold and harsh environment sustainable. However, climate change made the sea routes increasingly dangerous. During winter, sea ice expanded, ports were blocked, and ships could no longer reach Europe safely. This effectively turned Greenland into an isolated island. Prolonged isolation made it difficult to obtain essential supplies and caused communities to fall behind in technological and cultural developments happening in Europe. Critical resources such as iron, farming tools, and shipbuilding materials were no longer arriving regularly. Isolation also took a toll on the morale and social cohesion of the communities. Being cut off from the outside world made it harder to develop creative solutions and adapt to new challenges. Losing contact with Europe wasn't just an economic blow, it created a social and cultural crisis as well. The Greenland Vikings struggled to obtain both food and supplies, and they fell behind in technological and cultural advancements. All of this drastically reduced their chances of survival. Recent research points to drought as a hidden but powerful force behind the decline of Greenland's Vikings. The Little Ice Age had already shortened the growing season, and now unpredictable rainfall made farming nearly impossible. Crops failed, fields turned barren, and feeding both people and livestock became a constant struggle. But the land wasn't the only problem. Local resources were vanishing. Trees had been cut down for homes, fuel, and ships, leaving the Vikings with barely enough timber to survive. Iron, essential for tools, nails, and weapons, was scarce. Without wood or iron, building and maintaining ships their lifeline to the outside world was nearly impossible. This deadly combination of drought and resource depletion created a perfect storm of survival challenges. Farmers couldn't rely on the soil, craftsmen had too little to work with, and trade routes were harder to maintain without seaworthy ships. Year after year, life grew tougher, forcing communities to stretch their limited resources to the breaking point. One of the most debated theories about Greenland's Viking collapse is cultural rigidity. the idea that their strict adherence to tradition kept them from adapting to a changing world. The Vikings brought familiar European farming methods to Greenland, but as the Little Ice Age set in, these methods became almost impossible to sustain. Barley fields failed, hay for livestock grew scarce, and harsh winters threatened survival. Meanwhile, the local population thrived by hunting seals, fishing, and using the land in ways perfectly suited to the Arctic. Yet the Vikings largely refused to adopt these strategies. They continued raising cattle and sheep, maintaining large homesteads, and depending on imported grain whenever possible. Even as walrus ivory trade dwindled, they clung to old economic habits instead of seeking new ways to survive. Tradition, hierarchy, and identity mattered more than practical adaptation. This stubbornness may have been deadly. While storms, drought, and resource shortages created immediate dangers, it was the Vikings' inability or unwillingness to change that slowly pushed them toward collapse. Some historians argue that if they had embraced local knowledge and adapted, they might have survived. Instead, their own cultural values became a barrier to survival, shaping a fate they could not escape. As Greenland's Viking settlements struggled with harsh winters, failing crops, and dwindling resources, tensions with the local population may have arisen. The locals had long mastered Arctic survival, hunting seals, fishing, and using every resource efficiently. The Vikings, however, were less adaptable, and competition for hunting grounds, fishing areas, and valuable resources like walrus tusks could have created friction. While there is no concrete evidence of large-scale warfare, even minor conflicts or disputes over land and food could have added stress to already vulnerable communities. These potential clashes may another challenge the Vikings faced. The last known records of Greenland's Vikings date to the early 15th century. After that, they vanished from history, leaving behind empty settlements, abandoned farms, and silent churches. Historians and archaeologists still debate exactly what happened. Did they slowly die out from famine and disease? Did some leave and integrate with other communities? Or were there unrecorded conflicts with the local population? The truth remains shrouded in mystery, making the story of Greenland's Vikings one of history's most haunting disappearances. Greenland's Vikings may have disappeared, but their story still speaks to us today. It's a tale of bravery, stubbornness, and survival against unimaginable odds of a people caught between tradition, a harsh environment, and a rapidly changing world. Their ruins stand as silent witnesses, reminding us that adaptation, resilience, and openness to change can mean the difference between survival and extinction. What do you think? Could we survive if faced with the same challenges? Or would history repeat itself?